This is American Government, 3rd edition, an OpenStax textbook. All OpenStax textbooks are covered under a Creative Commons license and are completely free.
You can find this audiobook anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and more.
Narrated by Brian Barrick
and Sarah Aria.
Chapter 16, Domestic Policy.
Introduction.
On August 4, 2016, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe sued the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, seeking an injunction on the construction of a 1,200-mile-long oil pipeline running through 4 states from North Dakota to Illinois. The tribe argued that building the pipeline near federally governed waters would harm important tribal cultural sites. Protests ensued, which grew in size and effectively blocked the pipeline company from completing its work. The company countersued the tribe. Numerous other actors became involved, including multiple federal judges, 2 presidents, Obama and Trump, and the governor, who called in the National Guard. While the initial outcome was that the pipeline was halted by the Obama administration, officials in the Trump administration quickly reactivated the project in early 2017. It was completed and is currently in operation. This scenario illustrates well the complexity of public policymaking as it actually occurs, and how particular instances of policy can cut across many different domains, including, in this case, the environment, energy policy, tribal sovereignty, and transportation issues. Each of the individual actors and institutions in the U.S. political system, such as the President, Congress, the courts, interest groups, and the media, gives us an idea of the component parts of the system and their functions. But in the study of public policy, we look at the larger picture and see all the parts working together to produce policy outcomes that ultimately affect citizens and their communities. What is public policy? How do different areas of policy differ? And what roles do policy analysts and advocates play? What programs does the national government currently provide? And how do budgetary policy and politics operate? This chapter answers these questions and more.
(16.1) What is public policy? Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the concept of public policy, discuss examples of public policy in action.
It is easy to imagine that when designers engineer a product like a car, they do so with the intent of satisfying the consumer. But the design of any complicated product must take into account the needs of regulators, transporters, assembly line workers, parts suppliers, and myriad other participants in the manufacture and shipment process. And manufacturers must also be aware that consumer tastes are fickle. A gas-guzzling sports car may appeal to an unmarried 20-something with no children, but what happens to product satisfaction when gas prices fluctuate or the individual gets married and has children? In many ways, the process of designing domestic policy isn't that much different. The government, just like auto companies, needs to ensure that its citizen consumers have access to an array of goods and services. And, just as in auto companies, a wide range of actors is engaged in figuring out how to do it. Sometimes, this process effectively provides policies that benefit citizens. But, just as often, the process of policymaking is muddied by the demands of competing interests, with different opinions about society's needs or the role that government should play in meeting them. To understand why, we begin by thinking about what we mean by the term public policy. Public policy defined. One approach to thinking about public policy is to see it as the broad strategy government uses to do its job. More formally, It is the relatively stable set of purposive governmental actions that address matters of concern to some part of society. This description is useful in that it helps to explain both what public policy is and what it isn't. First, public policy is a guide to legislative action that is more or less fixed for long periods of time, not just short-term fixes or single legislative acts. Policy also doesn't happen by accident, and it is rarely formed simply as the result of the campaign promises of a single elected official, even the president. While elected officials are often important in shaping policy, most policy outcomes are the result of considerable debate, compromise, and refinement that happen over years and are finalized only after input from multiple institutions within government, as well as from interest groups and the public. Consider the example of healthcare expansion. A follower of politics in the news media may come away thinking the reforms implemented in 2010 were as sudden as they were sweeping, having been developed in the final weeks before they were enacted. The reality is that expanding healthcare access had actually been a priority of the Democratic Party for several decades. What may have seemed like a policy developed over a period of months was in fact formed after years of analysis, reflection upon existing policy, and even trial implementation of similar types of programs at the state level. Even before the passage of the ACA in 2010, which expanded healthcare coverage to millions, and of the HCERA also in 2010, more than 50% of all healthcare expenditures in the United States already came from federal government programs, such as Medicare and Medicaid. Several House and Senate members from both parties, along with First Lady Hillary Clinton, had proposed significant expansions in federal healthcare policy during the Democratic administration of Bill Clinton, providing a number of different options for any eventual healthcare overhaul. Much of what became the ACA was drawn from proposals originally developed at the state level by none other than Obama's 2012 Republican presidential opponent, Mitt Romney, when he was governor of Massachusetts. In addition to being thoughtful and generally stable, public policy deals with issues of concern to some large segment of society, as opposed to matters of interest only to individuals or a small group of people. Governments frequently interact with individual actors like citizens, corporations, or other countries. They may even pass highly specialized pieces of legislation, known as private bills, which confer specific privileges on individual entities. But public policy covers only those issues that are of interest to larger segments of society or that directly or indirectly affect society as a whole. Paying off the loans of a specific individual would not be public policy, but creating a process for loan forgiveness available to certain types of borrowers, such as those who provide a public service by becoming teachers, would certainly rise to the level of public policy. A final important characteristic of public policy is that it is more than just the actions of government. It also includes the behaviors or outcomes that government action creates. Policy can even be made when government refuses to act in ways that would change the status quo, when circumstances or public opinion begin to shift. For example, much of the debate over gun safety policy in the United States has centered on the unwillingness of Congress to act, even in the face of public opinion that supports some changes to gun policy. In fact, one of the last major changes occurred in 2004, when lawmakers' inaction resulted in the expiration of a piece of legislation, known as the Federal Assault Weapons Ban of 1994. Public policy as outcomes. Governments rarely want to keep their policies a secret. Elected officials want to be able to take credit for the things they have done to help their constituents, and their opponents are all too willing to cast blame when policy initiatives fail. We can therefore think of policy as the formal expression of what elected or appointed officials are trying to accomplish. In passing the HCERA in 2010, Congress declared its policy through an act that directed how it would appropriate money. The president can also implement or change policy through an executive order, which offers instructions about how to implement law under the president's discretion. Finally, policy changes can come as a result of court actions or opinions, such as Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954, which formally ended school segregation in the United States. Typically, elected or even high-ranking appointed officials lack either the specific expertise or tools needed to successfully create and implement public policy on their own. They turn instead to the vast government bureaucracy to provide policy guidance. For example, when Congress passed the Clean Water Act in 1972, it dictated that steps should be taken to improve water quality throughout the country. But it ultimately left it to the bureaucracy to figure out exactly how clean water needed to be. In doing so, Congress provided the Environmental Protection Agency with discretion to determine how much pollution is allowed in U.S. waterways. There is one more way of thinking about policy outcomes, in terms of winners and losers. Almost by definition, public policy promotes certain types of behavior while punishing others. So, the individuals or corporations that a policy favors are most likely to benefit or win, whereas those the policy ignores or punishes are likely to lose. Even the best intended policies can have unintended consequences, and may even ultimately harm someone, if only those who must pay for the policy through higher taxes. A policy designed to encourage students to go to liberal arts colleges may cause trade school enrollment to decline. Strategies to promote diversity in higher education may make it more difficult for qualified white or male applicants to get accepted into competitive programs. Efforts to clean up drinking water supplies may make companies less competitive and cost employees their livelihood. Even something that seems to help everyone, such as promoting charitable giving through tax incentives, runs the risk of lowering tax revenues from the rich, who contribute a greater share of their income to charity, and shifting tax burdens to the poor, who must spend a higher share of their income to achieve a desired standard of living. And while policy pronouncements and bureaucratic actions are certainly meant to rationalize policy, it is whether a given policy helps or hurts constituents, or is perceived to do so, that ultimately determines how voters will react toward the government in future elections.
Finding a middle ground. The social safety net. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the United States created a set of policies and programs that constituted a social safety net for the millions who had lost their jobs, their homes, and their savings. Under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the federal government began programs like the Work Progress Administration and Civilian Conservation Corps to combat unemployment, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation to refinance depression-related mortgage debts. As the effects of the Depression eased, the government phased out many of these programs. Other programs like Social Security or the minimum wage remain an important part of the way the government takes care of the vulnerable members of its population. The federal government has also added further social support programs like Medicaid, Medicare, and the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children to ensure a baseline or minimal standard of living for all, even in the direst of times. In recent decades, however, some have criticized these safety net programs for inefficiency and for incentivizing welfare dependence. They deride government leeches who use food stamps to buy lobster or other seemingly inappropriate items. Critics deeply resent the use of taxpayer money to relieve social problems like unemployment and poverty. Workers who may themselves be struggling to put food on the table or pay the mortgage feel their hard-earned money should not support other families. If I can get by without government support, the reasoning goes, those welfare families can do the same. Their poverty is not my problem. So where should the government draw the line? While there have been some instances of welfare fraud, the welfare reforms of the 1990s have made long-term dependence on the federal government less likely as the welfare safety net was pushed to the states. And with the income gap between the richest and the poorest at its highest level in history, this topic is likely to continue to receive much discussion in the coming years. Where is the middle ground in the public policy argument over the social safety net? How can the government protect its most vulnerable citizens without placing an undue burden on others? (16.2) Categorizing public policy. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you'll be able to describe the different types of goods in a society, identify key public policy domains in the United States, compare the different forms of policy and the way they transfer goods within a society.
The idea of public policy is by its very nature a politically contentious one. Among the differences between American liberals and conservatives are the policy preferences prevalent in each group. Modern liberals tend to feel very comfortable with the idea of the government shepherding progressive social and economic reforms, believing that these will lead to outcomes more equitable and fair for all members of society. Conservatives, on the other hand, often find government involvement onerous and overreaching. They feel society would function more efficiently if oversight of most public matters were returned to the private sphere. Before digging too deeply into a discussion of the nature of public policy in the United States, let us look first at why so many aspects of society come under the umbrella of public policy to begin with. Different types of goods. Think for a minute about what it takes to make people happy and satisfied. As we live our daily lives, we experience a range of physical, psychological, and social needs that must be met in order for us to be happy and productive. At the very least, we require food, water, and shelter. In very basic subsistence societies, people acquire these through farming crops, digging wells, and creating shelter from local materials. People also need social interaction with others and the ability to secure goods they acquire, lest someone else try to take them. As their tastes become more complex, they may find it advantageous to exchange their items for others. This requires not only a mechanism for barter, but also a system of transportation. The more complex these systems are, the greater the range of items people can access to keep them alive and make them happy. However, this increase in possessions also creates a stronger need to secure what they have acquired. Economists use the term goods to describe the range of commodities, services, and systems that help us satisfy our wants or needs. This term can certainly apply to the food you eat or the home you live in, but it can also describe the systems of transportation or public safety used to protect them. Most of the goods you interact with in your daily life are private goods, which means that they can be owned by a particular person or group of people, and are excluded from use by others, typically by means of a price. For example, your home or apartment is a private good reserved for your own use, because you pay rent or make mortgage payments for the privilege of living there. Further, private goods are finite and can run out if overused, even if only in the short term. The fact that private goods are excludable and finite makes them tradable. A farmer who grows corn, for instance, owns that corn. And since only a finite amount of corn exists, others may want to trade their goods for it if their own food supplies begin to dwindle. Proponents of free market economics believe that the market forces of supply and demand, working without any government involvement, are the most effective way for markets to operate. One of the basic principles of free market economics is that for just about any good that can be privatized, the most efficient means for exchange is the marketplace. A well-functioning market will allow producers of goods to come together with consumers of goods to negotiate a trade. People facilitate trade by creating a currency, a common unit of exchange, so they do not need to carry around everything they may want to trade at all times. As long as there are several providers or sellers of the same good, consumers can negotiate with them to find a price they are willing to pay. As long as there are several buyers for a seller's goods, providers can negotiate with them to find a price buyers are willing to accept. And, the logic goes, if prices begin to rise too much, other sellers will enter the marketplace offering lower prices. A second basic principle of free market economics is that it is largely unnecessary for the government to protect the value of private goods. Farmers who own land used for growing food have a vested interest in protecting their land to ensure its continued production. Business owners must protect the reputation of their business, or no one will buy from them. And to the degree that producers need to ensure the quality of their product or industry, they can accomplish that by creating a group or association that operates outside government control. In short, industries have an interest in self-regulating to protect their own value. According to free market economics, as long as everything we could ever want or need is a private good, and so long as every member of society has some ability to provide for themselves and their families, public policy regulating the exchange of goods and services is really unnecessary. Some people in the United States argue that the self-monitoring and self-regulating incentives provided by the existence of private goods mean that sound public policy requires very little government action. Known as libertarians, these individuals believe government almost always operates less efficiently than the private sector, the segment of the economy run for profit and not under government control, and that government actions should therefore be kept to a minimum. Even as many in the United States recognize the benefits provided by private goods, we have increasingly come to recognize problems with the idea that all social problems can be solved by exclusively private ownership. First, not all goods can be classified as strictly private. Can you really consider the air you breathe to be private? Air is a difficult good to privatize because it is not excludable. Everyone can get access to it at all times. And no matter how much of it you breathe, there is still plenty to go around. Geographic regions like forests have environmental, social, recreational, and aesthetic value that cannot easily be reserved for private ownership. Resources like migrating birds or schools of fish may have value if hunted or fished, but they cannot be owned due to their migratory nature. Finally, national security provided by the armed forces protects all citizens and cannot reasonably be reserved for only a few. These are all examples of what economists call public goods, sometimes referred to as collective goods. Unlike private property, they are not excludable and are essentially infinite. Forests, water, and fisheries, however, are a type of public good called common goods, which are not excludable but may be finite. The problem with both public and common goods is that since no one owns them, no one has a financial interest in protecting their long-term or future value. Without government regulation, factory owners can feel free to pollute the air or water, since they will have no responsibility for the pollution once the winds or waves carry it somewhere else. Without government regulation, someone can hunt all the migratory birds or deplete a fishery by taking all the fish, eliminating future breeding stocks that would maintain the population. The situation in which individuals exhaust a common resource by acting on their own immediate self-interest is called the tragedy of the commons. A second problem with strict adherence to free market economics is that some goods are too large or too expensive for individuals to provide them for themselves. Consider the need for a marketplace. Where does the marketplace come from? How do we get the goods to market? Who provides the roads and bridges? Who patrols the waterways? Who provides security? Who ensures the regulation of the currency? No individual buyer or seller could accomplish this. The very nature of the exchange of private goods requires a system that has some of the openness of public or common goods, but is maintained by either groups of individuals or entire societies. Economists consider goods like cable TV, cell phone service, and private schools to be toll goods. Toll goods are similar to public goods in that they are open to all and theoretically infinite if maintained, but they are paid for or provided by some outside non-government entity. Many people can make use of them, but only if they can pay the price. The name toll goods comes from the fact that early on, many toll roads were in fact privately owned commodities. Even today, states from Virginia to California have allowed private companies to build public roads in exchange for the right to profit by charging tolls. So long as land was plentiful, and most people in the United States lived a largely rural subsistence lifestyle, the difference between private, public, common, and toll goods was mostly academic. But as public lands increasingly became private through sale and settlement, and as industrialization and the rise of mass production allowed monopolies and oligopolies to become more influential, support for public policies regulating private entities grew. By the beginning of the 20th century, led by the progressives, the United States had begun to search for ways to govern large businesses that had managed to distort market forces by monopolizing the supply of goods. And, largely as a result of the Great Depression, people wanted ways of developing and protecting public goods that were fairer and more equitable than had existed before. These forces and events led to the increased regulation of public and common goods, and a move for the public sector, the government, to take over the provision of many toll goods. Classic types of policy. Public policy, then, ultimately boils down to determining the distribution, allocation, and enjoyment of public, common, and toll goods within a society. While the specifics of policy often depend on the circumstances, two broad questions all policymakers must consider are A, who pays the costs of creating and maintaining the goods, and B, who receives the benefits of the goods. When private goods are bought and sold in a marketplace, the costs and benefits go to the participants in the transaction. Your landlord benefits from receipt of the rent you pay, and you benefit by having a place to live. But non-private goods like roads, waterways, and national parks are controlled and regulated by someone other than the owners, allowing policymakers to make decisions about who pays and who benefits. In 1964, Theodore Lowy argued that it was possible to categorize policy based upon the degree to which costs and benefits were concentrated on the few or diffused across the many. One policy category, known as distributive policy, tends to collect payments or resources from many, but concentrates direct benefits on relatively few. Highways are often developed through distributive policy. Distributive policy is also common when society feels there is a social benefit to individuals obtaining private goods, such as higher education, that offer long-term benefits, but the upfront cost may be too high for the average citizen. One example of the way distributive policy works is the story of the Transcontinental Railroad. In the 1860s, the U.S. government began to recognize the value of building a robust railroad system to move passengers and freight around the country. A particular goal was connecting California and the other Western territories acquired during the 1840s war with Mexico to the rest of the country. The problem was that constructing a nationwide railroad system was a costly and risky proposition. To build and support continuous rail lines, private investors would need to gain access to tens of thousands of miles of land, some of which might be owned by private citizens. The solution was to charter two private corporations, the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads, and provide them with resources and land grants to facilitate the construction of the railroads. Through these grants, publicly owned land was distributed to private citizens, who could then use it for their own gain. However, a broader public gain was simultaneously being provided in the form of a nationwide transportation network. The same process operates in the agricultural sector, where various federal programs help farmers and food producers through price supports and crop insurance, among other forms of assistance. These programs help individual farmers and agriculture companies stay afloat and realize consistent profits. They also achieve the broader goal of providing plenty of sustenance for the people of the United States, so that few of us have to live off the land. Other examples of distributive policy support citizens' efforts to achieve the American dream. American society recognizes the benefits of having citizens who are financially invested in the country's future. Among the best ways to encourage this investment are to ensure that citizens are highly educated and have the ability to acquire high-cost private goods such as homes and businesses. However, very few people have the savings necessary to pay upfront for a college education, a first home purchase, or the startup costs of a business. To help out, the government has created a range of incentives that everyone in the country pays for through taxes, but that directly benefit only the recipients. Examples include grants, such as Pell Grants, tax credits and deductions, and subsidized or federally guaranteed loans. Each of these programs aims to achieve a policy outcome. Pell Grants exist to help students graduate from college, whereas Federal Housing Administration mortgage loans lead to home ownership. A related distributive project is the effort to bring broadband internet to remote rural areas of the country that have disproportionately felt the negative effects of the digital divide. Such a project is the most ambitious infrastructure initiative since the Rural Electrification Act. Broadband is spreading slowly for now, mostly helped along by rural co-ops. However, multiple federal agencies are investigating how to help this effort, including the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Federal Communications Commission. While distributive policy, according to Lowy, has diffuse costs and concentrated benefits, regulatory policy features the opposite arrangement, with concentrated costs and diffuse benefits. A relatively small number of groups or individuals bear the costs of regulatory policy, but its benefits are expected to be distributed broadly across society. As you might imagine, regulatory policy is most effective for controlling or protecting public or common resources. Among the best-known examples are policies designed to protect public health and safety and the environment. These regulatory policies prevent manufacturers or businesses from maximizing their profits by excessively polluting the air or water, selling products they know to be harmful, or compromising the health of their employees during production. In the United States, nationwide calls for a more robust regulatory policy first grew loud around the turn of the 20th century and the dawn of the industrial age. Investigative journalists called muckrakers by politicians and business leaders who were the focus of their investigations began to expose many of the ways in which manufacturers were abusing the public trust. Although various forms of corruption topped the list of abuses, among the most famous muckraker exposés was The Jungle, a 1906 novel by Upton Sinclair that focused on unsanitary working conditions and unsavory business practices in the meatpacking industry. This work and others like it helped to spur the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, and ultimately led to the creation of government agencies such as the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA. The nation's experiences during the Depression of 1896 and the Great Depression of the 1930s also led to more robust regulatory policies designed to improve the transparency of financial markets and prevent monopolies from forming. A final type of policy is redistributive policy, So named because it redistributes resources in society from one group to another. That is, according to Lowy, the costs are concentrated and so are the benefits. But different groups bear the costs and enjoy the benefits. Most redistributive policies are intended to have a sort of Robin Hood effect. Their goal is to transfer income and wealth from one group to another, such that everyone enjoys at least a minimal standard of living. Typically, the wealthy and middle class pay into the federal tax base, which then funds need-based programs that support low-income individuals and families. A few examples of redistributive policies are Head Start, Pell Grants, Medicaid, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families or TANF, and food programs like the Supplementary Nutritional Aid Program, SNAP. The government also uses redistribution to incentivize specific behaviors or aid small groups of people. Pell Grants to encourage college attendance and tax credits to encourage home ownership are other examples of redistribution.
Milestone: the Hoover Dam, the federal effort to domesticate the Colorado River. As westward expansion led to development of the American Southwest, settlers increasingly realized that they needed a way to control the frequent floods and droughts that made agriculture difficult in the region. As early as 1890, land speculators had tried diverting the Colorado River for this purpose, but it wasn't until 1922 that the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, then called the Reclamation Service, chose the Black Canyon as a good location for a dam to divert the river. Since it would affect 7 states, as well as Mexico, the federal government took the lead on the project, which eventually cost $49 million and more than 100 lives. The dam faced significant opposition from members of other states, who felt its massive price tag, almost $670 million in today's dollars, benefited only a small group, not the whole nation. However, in 1928, Senator Hiram Johnson and Representative Phil Swing, both Republicans from California, won the day. Congress passed the Boulder Canyon Project Act, authorizing the construction of one of the most ambitious engineering feats in U.S. history. The Hoover Dam, completed in 1935, served the dual purpose of generating hydroelectric power and irrigating 2 million acres of land from the resulting reservoir, Lake Mead. Was the construction of the Hoover Dam an effective expression of public policy? Why or why not? (16.3) Policy Arenas. Learning Objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the key domestic arenas of public policy, describe the major social safety net programs, list the key agencies responsible for promoting and regulating U.S. business and industry.
In practice, public policy consists of specific programs that provide resources to members of society, create regulations that protect U.S. citizens, and attempt to equitably fund the government. We can broadly categorize most policies based on their goals or the sector of society they affect, although many, such as food stamps, serve multiple purposes. Implementing these policies cost hundreds of billions of dollars each year, and understanding the goals of this spending and where the money goes is of vital importance to citizens and students of politics alike. Social welfare policy. The U.S. government began developing a social welfare policy during the Great Depression of the 1930s. By the 1960s, social welfare had become a major function of the federal government, one to which most public policy funds are devoted, and had developed to serve several overlapping functions. First, social welfare policy is designed to ensure some level of equity in a democratic political system based on competitive free market economics. During the Great Depression, many politicians came to fear that the high unemployment and low income levels plaguing society could threaten the stability of democracy, as was happening in European countries like Germany and Italy. The assumption in this thinking is that democratic systems work best when poverty is minimized. In societies operating in survival mode, in contrast, people tend to focus more on short-term problem solving than on long-term planning. Second, social welfare policy creates an automatic stimulus for a society by building a safety net that can catch members of society who are suffering economic hardship through no fault of their own. For an individual family, this safety net makes the difference between eating and starving. For an entire economy, it could prevent an economic recession from sliding into a broader and more damaging depression. One of the oldest and largest pieces of social welfare policy is Social Security, which cost the United States about $845 billion in 2014 alone. These costs are offset by a 12.4% payroll tax on all wages up to $118,500. Employers and workers who are not self-employed split the bill for each worker, whereas the self-employed pay their entire share. Social Security was conceived as a solution to several problems inherent to the industrial-era economy. First, by the 1920s and 1930s, an increasing number of workers were earning their living through manual or day-wage labor that depended on their ability to engage in physical activity. As their bodies weakened with age, or if they were injured, their ability to provide for themselves and their families was compromised. Second, and of particular concern, were urban widows. During their working years, most American women stayed home to raise children and maintain the household, while their husbands provided income. Should their husbands die or become injured, these women had no wage-earning skills with which to support themselves or their families. Social Security addresses these concerns with three important tools. First and best known is the retirement benefit. After completing a minimum number of years of work, American workers may claim a form of pension upon reaching retirement age. It is often called an entitlement program, since it guarantees benefits to a particular group, and virtually everyone will eventually qualify for the plan given the relatively low requirements for enrollment. The amount of money a worker receives is based loosely on that worker's lifetime earnings. Full retirement age was originally set at 65. Although changes in legislation have increased it to 67 for workers born after 1959. A valuable added benefit is that, under certain circumstances, this income may also be claimed by the survivors of qualifying workers, such as spouses and minor children, even if they themselves did not have a wage income. A second Social Security benefit is a disability payout, which the government distributes to workers who become unable to work due to disability. To qualify, workers must demonstrate that the injury or incapacitation will last at least 12 months. A third and final benefit is supplemental security income, which provides supplemental income to adults or children with considerable disability or to the elderly who fall below an income threshold. During the George W. Bush administration, Social Security became a highly politicized topic as the Republican Party sought to find a way of preventing what experts predicted would be the impending collapse of the Social Security system. In 1950, the ratio of workers paying into the program to beneficiaries receiving payments was 16.5 to 1. In 2020, that number stood at 2.8 to 1 and is expected to fall to 2.3 to 1 by 2035. Most predictions, in fact, suggest that due to continuing demographic changes, including slower population growth and an aging population, by 2033, the amount of revenue generated from payroll taxes will no longer be sufficient to cover costs. The Bush administration proposed avoiding this by privatizing the program, in effect taking it out of the government's hands and making individuals' benefits variable instead of defined. The effort ultimately failed, and Social Security's long-term viability continues to remain uncertain. Numerous other plans for saving the program have been proposed, including raising the retirement age, increasing payroll taxes, especially on the wealthy, by removing the income cap, $142,800 in 2021, and reducing payouts for wealthier retirees. None of these proposals have been able to gain traction, however. While Social Security was designed to provide cash payments to sustain elderly people and some people with disabilities, Medicare and Medicaid were intended to ensure that vulnerable populations have access to health care. Medicare, like Social Security, is an entitlement program funded through payroll taxes. Its purpose is to make sure that senior citizens and retirees have access to low-cost health care they might not otherwise have, because most U.S. citizens get their health insurance through their employers. Medicare provides three major forms of coverage: a guaranteed insurance benefit that helps cover major hospitalization, fee-based supplemental coverage that retirees can use to lower costs for doctor visits and other health expenses, and a prescription drug benefit. Medicare faces many of the same long-term challenges as Social Security, due to the same demographic shifts. Medicare also faces the problem that healthcare costs are rising significantly faster than inflation. In 2019, Medicare cost the federal government approximately $796 billion. Medicaid is a formula-based health insurance program, which means beneficiaries must demonstrate they fall within a particular income category. Individuals in the Medicaid program receive a fairly comprehensive set of health benefits, although access to health care may be limited because fewer providers accept payments from the program. It pays them less for services than does Medicare. Medicaid differs dramatically from Medicare in that it is partially funded by states, many of which have reduced access to the program by setting the income threshold so low that few people qualify. The ACA, 2010, sought to change that by providing more federal money to the states if they agreed to raise minimum income requirements. 12 states have refused, which has helped to keep the overall costs of Medicaid lower, even though it has also left many people without health coverage they might receive if they lived elsewhere. Total costs for Medicaid in 2020 were about $627 billion, about $405 billion of which was paid by the federal government. Collectively, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid make up the lion's share of total federal government spending, almost 48% in 2019. Several other smaller programs also provide income support to families. Most of these are formula-based or means-tested, requiring citizens to meet certain maximum income requirements in order to qualify. A few examples are TANF, SNAP, also called food stamps, the Unemployment Insurance Program, and various housing assistance programs. Collectively, these programs add up to a little over $361 billion. Science, technology, and education. After World War II ended, the United States quickly realized that it had to address two problems to secure its fiscal and national security future. The first was that more than 10 million servicemen and women needed to be reintegrated into the workforce, and many lacked appreciable work skills. The second problem was that the United States' success in its new conflict with the Soviet Union depended on the rapid development of a new, highly technical military-industrial complex. To confront these challenges, the U.S. government passed several important pieces of legislation to provide education assistance to workers and research dollars to industry. As the needs of American workers and industry have changed, many of these programs have evolved from their original purposes, but they still remain important pieces of the public policy debate. Much of the nation's science and technology policy benefits its military, for instance, in the form of research and development funding for a range of defense projects. The federal government still promotes research for civilian uses, mostly through the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Recent debate over these agencies has focused on whether government funding is necessary or if private entities would be better suited. For example, although NASA continues to develop a replacement for the now defunct U.S. Space Shuttle program, much of its workload is currently being performed by private companies working to develop their own space launch, resupply, and tourism programs. The problem of trying to direct and fund the education of a modern U.S. workforce is familiar to many students of American government. Educational systems exist to carry out two distinct and lofty goals. First, they educate and provide opportunity to a learned society of individuals who can together govern society and run communities. Second, our educational institutions provide practical training for students to make a living. Therefore, governments and communities must simultaneously educate young people to be creative and responsible citizens, while also providing practical job training programs for the workforces that communities, states, and the country need. Historically, education has largely been the job of states. While they have provided a very robust K-12 public education system, the national government has never moved to create an equivalent system of national higher education academies or universities, as many other countries have done. As the need to keep the nation competitive with others became more pressing, however, the U.S. government did step in to direct its education dollars toward creating greater equity and ease of access to the existing public and private systems. The overwhelming portion of the federal government's higher education money is spent on student loans, grants, and work-study programs. Resources are set aside to cover job retraining programs for individuals who lack private sector skills or who need to be retrained to meet changes in the economy's demands for the labor force. National policy toward elementary and secondary education programs has typically focused on increasing resources available to school districts for non-traditional programs such as preschool and special needs, or helping poorer schools stay competitive with wealthier institutions. Business stimulus and regulation. A final key aspect of domestic policy is the growth and regulation of business. The size and strength of the economy is very important to politicians, whose jobs depend on citizens believing in their own future prosperity. At the same time, people in the United States want to live in a world where they feel safe from unfair or environmentally damaging business practices. These desires have forced the government to perform a delicate balancing act between programs that help grow the economy by providing benefits to the business sector and those that protect consumers, often by curtailing or regulating the business sector. Two of the largest recipients of government aid to businesses are agriculture and energy. Both are multi-billion-dollar industries concentrated in rural and/or electorally influential states. Because voters are affected by the health of these sectors every time they pay their grocery or utility bill, the U.S. government has chosen to provide significant agriculture and energy subsidies to cover the risks inherent in the unpredictability of the weather and oil exploration. Government subsidies also protect these industries' profitability. These two purposes have even overlapped in the government's controversial decision to subsidize the production of ethanol, a fuel source similar to gasoline but generated from corn. When it comes to regulation, the federal government has created several agencies responsible for providing everything from worker safety, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, to food safety, FDA, to consumer protection, where the recently created Bureau of Consumer Protection ensures that businesses do not mislead consumers with deceptive or manipulative practices. Another prominent federal agency, the EPA, is charged with ensuring that businesses do not excessively pollute the nation's air or waterways. A complex array of additional regulatory agencies governs specific industries such as banking and finance, which are detailed later in this chapter.
(16.4) Policymakers. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you'll be able to identify types of policymakers in different issue areas, describe the public policy process.
Many Americans were concerned when Congress began debating the Affordable Care Act, ACA. As the program took shape, some people felt the changes it proposed were being debated too hastily, would be implemented too quickly, or would summarily give the government control over an important piece of the U.S. economy, the healthcare industry. Ironically, the government had been heavily engaged in providing healthcare for decades. More than 50% of all healthcare dollars spent were being spent by the U.S. government well before the ACA was enacted. As you have already learned, Medicare was created decades earlier. Despite protesters' resistance to government involvement in healthcare, there is no keeping government out of Medicare. The government is Medicare. What many did not realize is that few, if any, of the proposals that eventually became part of the ACA were original. While the country was worried about problems like terrorism, the economy, and conflicts over LGBTQ rights, armies of individuals were debating the best ways to fix the nation's healthcare delivery. Two important but overlapping groups defended their preferred policy changes: policy advocates and policy analysts. Policy advocates. Take a minute to think of a policy change you believe would improve some condition in the United States. Now ask yourself this: why do I want to change this policy? Are you motivated by a desire for justice? Do you feel the policy change would improve your life or that of members of your community? Is your sense of morality motivating you to change the status quo? Would your profession be helped? Do you feel that changing the policy might raise your status? Most people have some policy position or issue they would like to see altered. One of the reasons the news media are so enduring is that citizens have a range of opinions on public policy, and they are very interested in debating how a given change would improve their lives or the country's. But despite their interests, most people do little more than vote or occasionally contribute to a political campaign. A few people, however, become policy advocates by actively working to propose or maintain public policy. One way to think about policy advocates is to recognize that they hold a normative position on an issue. That is, they have a conviction about what should or ought to be done. The best public policy, in their view, is one that accomplishes a specific goal or outcome. For this reason, advocates often begin with an objective and then try to shape or create proposals that help them accomplish that goal. Facts, evidence, and analysis are important tools for convincing policymakers or the general public of the benefits of their proposals. Private citizens often find themselves in advocacy positions, particularly if they are required to take on leadership roles in their private lives or in their organizations. The most effective advocates are usually hired professionals who form lobbying groups or think tanks to promote their agenda. A lobbying group that frequently takes on advocacy roles is AARP, formerly the American Association of Retired Persons. AARP's primary job is to convince the government to provide more public resources and services to senior citizens, often through regulatory or redistributive politics. Chief among its goals are lower healthcare costs and the safety of Social Security pension payments. These aims put AARP in the Democratic Party's electoral coalition, since most Democrats have historically been stronger advocates for Medicare's creation and expansion. In 2002, for instance, Democrats and Republicans were debating a major change to Medicare. The Democratic Party supported expanding Medicare to include free or low-cost prescription drugs, while the Republicans preferred a plan that would require seniors to purchase drug insurance through a private insurer. The government would subsidize costs, but many seniors would still have substantial out-of-pocket expenses. To the surprise of many, AARP supported the Republican proposal. While Democrats argued that their position would have provided a better deal for individuals, AARP reasoned that the Republican plan had a much better chance of passing. The Republicans controlled the House and looked likely to reclaim control of the Senate in the upcoming election. Then President George W. Bush was a Republican and would almost certainly have vetoed the Democratic approach. AARP's support for the legislation helped shore up support for Republicans in the 2002 midterm election, and also helped convince a number of moderate Democrats to support the bill, with some changes, which passed despite apparent public disapproval. AARP had done its job as an advocate for seniors by creating a new benefit it hoped could later be expanded, rather than fighting for an extreme position that would have left it with nothing. Not all policy advocates are as willing to compromise their positions. It is much easier for a group like AARP to compromise over the amount of money seniors will receive, for instance, than it is for an evangelical religious group to compromise over issues like abortion, or for civil rights groups to accept something less than equality. Nor are women's rights groups likely to accept pay inequality as it currently exists. It is easier to compromise over financial issues than over our individual views of morality or social justice. Policy analysts. A second approach to creating public policy is a bit more objective. Rather than starting with what ought to happen and seeking ways to make it so, policy analysts try to identify all the possible choices available to a decision maker and then gauge their impacts if implemented. The goal of the analyst isn't really to encourage the implementation of any of the options. Rather, it is to make sure decision makers are fully informed about the implications of the decisions they do make. Understanding the financial and other costs and benefits of policy choices requires analysts to make strategic guesses about how the public and government actors will respond. For example, when policymakers are considering changes to healthcare policy, one very important question is how many people will participate? If very few people had chosen to take advantage of the new healthcare plans available under the ACA marketplace, it would have been significantly cheaper than advocates proposed. But it also would have failed to accomplish the key goal of increasing the number of insured. But if people who currently have insurance had dropped it to take advantage of ACA's subsidies, the program's costs would have skyrocketed, with very little real benefit to public health. Similarly, had all states chosen to create their own marketplaces, the cost and complexity of ACA's implementation would have been greatly reduced. Because advocates have an incentive to understate costs and overstate benefits, policy analysis tends to be a highly politicized aspect of government. It is critical for policymakers and voters that policy analysts provide the most accurate analysis possible. A number of independent or semi-independent think tanks have sprung up in Washington, D.C. to provide assessments of policy options. Most businesses or trade organizations also employ their own policy analysis wings to help them understand proposed changes or even offer some of their own. Some of these try to be as impartial as possible. Most, however, have a known bias toward policy advocacy. The Cato Institute, for example, is a well-known and highly respected policy analysis group that both liberal and conservative politicians have turned to when considering policy options. But the Cato Institute has a known libertarian bias. Most of the problems it selects for analysis have the potential for private sector solutions. This means its analysts tend to include the rosiest assumptions of economic growth when considering tax cuts and to overestimate the costs of public sector proposals. Both the Congress and the President have tried to reduce the bias in policy analysis by creating their own, theoretically nonpartisan policy branches. In Congress, the best known of these is the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO. Authorized in the 1974 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act, the CBO was formally created in 1975 as a way of increasing Congress's independence from the executive branch. The CBO is responsible for scoring the spending or revenue impact of all proposed legislation to assess its net effect on the budget. In recent years, it has been the CBO's responsibility to provide Congress with guidance on how to best balance the budget. The formulas that the CBO uses in scoring the budget have become an important part of the policy debate, even as the group has tried to maintain its nonpartisan nature. In the executive branch, each individual department and agency is technically responsible for its own policy analysis. The assumption is that experts in the Federal Communications Commission or the Federal Elections Commission are best equipped to evaluate the impact of various proposals within their policy domain. Law requires that most regulatory changes made by the federal government also include the opportunity for public input, so the government can both gauge public opinion and seek outside perspectives. Executive branch agencies are usually also charged with considering the economic impact of regulatory action, although some agencies have been better at this than others. Critics frequently singled out the EPA and OSHA for failing to adequately consider the impact of new rules on business. Within the White House itself, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, was created to serve the President of the United States in implementing his or her vision of policy. Policy analysis is important to the OMB's function, but as you can imagine, it frequently compromises its objectivity during policy formulation. The policy process. The policy process contains 4 sequential stages. 1. Agenda setting. 2. Policy enactment. 3. Policy implementation. And 4. Evaluation. Given the sheer number of issues already processed by the government, called the continuing agenda, and the large number of new proposals being pushed out at any one time, it is typically quite difficult to move a new policy all the way through the process. Agenda setting is the crucial first stage of the public policy process. Agenda setting has 2 subphases: problem identification and alternative specification. Problem identification identifies the issues that merit discussion. Not all issues make it onto the governmental agenda because there's only so much attention that government can pay. Thus, one of the more important tasks for a policy advocate is to frame the issue in a compelling way that raises a persuasive dimension or critical need. For example, healthcare reform has been attempted on many occasions over the years. One key to making the topic salient has been to frame it in terms of healthcare access, highlighting the percentage of people who do not have health insurance. Alternative specification, the second subphase of agenda setting, considers solutions to fix the difficulty raised in problem identification. For example, government officials may agree in the problem subphase that the increase in childhood obesity presents a societal problem worthy of government attention. However, the solution can be complex, and people who otherwise agree might come into conflict over what the best answer is. Alternatives might range from reinvestment in school physical education programs and health education classes, to taking soda and candy machines out of the schools and requiring good nutrition in school lunches. Agenda setting ends when a given problem has been selected, a solution has been paired with that problem, and the solution goes to the decision makers for a vote. Acid rain, which results from the interaction of rainstorms and thick air pollution, provides another nice illustration of agenda setting and the problems and solutions subphases. Acid rain is a widely recognized problem that did not make it onto the governmental policy agenda until Congress passed the Air Quality Act of 1967, long after environmental groups started asking for laws to regulate pollution. In the second policy phase, enactment, the elected branches of government typically consider one specific solution to a problem and decide whether to pass it. This stage is the most visible one and usually garners the most press coverage. And yet, it is somewhat anticlimactic. By the time a specific policy proposal or solution comes out of agenda setting for a yes or no vote, it can be something of a foregone conclusion that it will pass. Once the policy has been enacted, usually by the legislative and/or executive branches of the government, like Congress or the president at the national level, or the legislature or governor of a state, governmental agencies do the work of actually implementing it. On a national level, policy implementation can either be top-down or bottom-up. In top-down implementation, the federal government dictates the specifics of the policy, and each state implements it in the same exact way. In bottom-up implementation, the federal government allows local areas some flexibility to meet their specific challenges and needs. Evaluation, the last stage of the process, should be tied directly to the policy's desired outcomes. Evaluation essentially asks, how well did this policy do what we designed it to do? The answers can sometimes be surprising. In one hotly debated case, the United States funded abstinence-only sex education for teens with the goal of reducing teen pregnancy. A 2011 study published in the journal PLOS One, however, found that abstinence-only education actually increased teen pregnancy rates. The most effective policy evaluations are systematic. For example, while a simple plotting of youth drug use data by year seemed to show no effect for the popular Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, or DARE, a more careful evaluation done with a control group that did not receive DARE messaging showed robust effectiveness. The information from the evaluation stage can feed back into the other stages, informing future decisions and creating a public policy cycle.
(16.5) Budgeting and Tax Policy. Learning Objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss economic theories that shape U.S. economic policy, explain how the government uses fiscal policy tools to maintain a healthy economy, analyze the taxing and spending decisions made by Congress and the President, discuss the role of the Federal Reserve Board in monetary policy.
A country spends, raises, and regulates money in accordance with its values. In all, the federal government's budget for 2020 was $6.55 trillion. This chapter has provided a brief overview of some of the budget's key areas of expenditure, and thus some insight into modern American values. But these values are only part of the budgeting story. Policymakers make considerable effort to ensure that long-term priorities are protected from the heat of the election cycle and short-term changes in public opinion. The decision to put some policymaking functions out of the reach of Congress also reflects economic philosophies about the best ways to grow, stimulate, and maintain the economy. The role of politics in drafting the annual budget is indeed large, but we should not underestimate the challenges elected officials face as a result of decisions made in the past. Approaches to the economy. Until the 1930s, most policy advocates argued that the best way for the government to interact with the economy was through a hands-off approach formerly known as laissez-faire economics. These policymakers believed the key to economic growth and development was the government's allowing private markets to operate efficiently. Proponents of this school of thought believed private investors were better equipped than governments to figure out which sectors of the economy were most likely to grow and which new products were most likely to be successful. They also tended to oppose government efforts to establish quality controls or health and safety standards, believing consumers themselves would punish bad behavior by not trading with poor corporate citizens. Finally, laissez-faire proponents felt that keeping government out of the business of business would create an automatic cycle of economic growth and contraction. Contraction phases in which there is no economic growth for 2 consecutive quarters, called recessions, would bring business failures and higher unemployment. But this condition, they believed, would correct itself on its own if the government simply allowed the system to operate. The Great Depression challenged the laissez-faire view, however. When President Franklin Roosevelt came to office in 1933, the United States had already been in the depths of the Great Depression for several years, since the stock market crash of 1929. Roosevelt sought to implement a new approach to economic regulation known as Keynesianism. Named for its developer, the economist John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian economics argues that it is possible for a recession to become so deep and last for so long that the typical models of economic collapse and recovery may not work. Keynes suggested that economic growth was closely tied to the ability of individuals to consume goods. It didn't matter how or where investors wanted to invest their money if no one could afford to buy the products they wanted to make. And in periods of extremely high unemployment, wages for newly hired labor would be so low that new workers would be unable to afford the products they produced. Keynesianism counters this problem by increasing government spending in ways that improve consumption. Some of the proposals Keynes suggested were payments or pension for the unemployed and retired, as well as tax incentives to encourage consumption in the middle class. His reasoning was that these individuals would be most likely to spend the money they received by purchasing more goods, which in turn would encourage production and investment. Keynes argued that the wealthy class of producers and employers had sufficient capital to meet the increased demand of consumers that government incentives would stimulate. Once consumption had increased and capital was flowing again, the government would reduce or eliminate its economic stimulus, and any money it had borrowed to create it could be repaid from higher tax revenues. Keynesianism dominated U.S. fiscal or spending policy from the 1930s to the 1970s. By the 1970s, however, high inflation began to slow economic growth. There were a number of reasons, including higher oil prices and the costs of fighting the Vietnam War. However, some economists, such as Arthur Laffer, began to argue that the social welfare and high tax policies created in the name of Keynesianism were overstimulating the economy, creating a situation in which demand for products had outstripped investors' willingness to increase production. They called for an approach known as supply-side economics, which argues that economic growth is largely a function of the productive capacity of a country. Supply-siders have argued that increased regulation and higher taxes reduce the incentive to invest new money into the economy, to the point where little growth can occur. They have advocated reducing taxes and regulations to spur economic growth. Mandatory spending versus discretionary spending. The desire of Keynesians to create a minimal level of aggregate demand, coupled with the Depression-era preference to promote social welfare policy, led the President and Congress to develop a federal budget with spending divided into 2 broad categories: mandatory and discretionary. Of these, mandatory spending is the larger, consisting of about $4.9 trillion of the 2020 budget, or roughly 71% of all federal expenditures. The overwhelming portion of mandatory spending is earmarked for entitlement programs guaranteed to those who meet certain qualifications, usually based on age, income, or disability. These programs, discussed earlier, include Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, and major income security programs such as unemployment insurance and SNAP. The costs of programs tied to age are relatively easy to estimate and grow largely as a function of the aging population. Income and disability payments are a bit more difficult to estimate. They tend to go down during periods of economic recovery and rise when the economy begins to slow down, in precisely the way Keynes suggested. A comparatively small piece of the mandatory spending pie, about 14%, is devoted to benefits designated for former federal employees, including military retirement and many Veterans Administration programs. Congress is ultimately responsible for setting the formulas for mandatory payouts. But as we saw in the earlier discussion regarding Social Security, major reforms to entitlement formulas are difficult to enact. As a result, the size and growth of mandatory spending in future budgets are largely a function of previous legislation that set the formulas up in the first place. So long as supporters of particular programs can block changes to the formulas, funding will continue almost on autopilot. Keynesians support this mandatory spending, along with other elements of social welfare policy, because they help maintain a minimal level of consumption that should, in theory, prevent recessions from turning into depressions, which are more severe downturns. Portions of the budget not devoted to mandatory spending are categorized as discretionary spending, because Congress must pass legislation to authorize money to be spent each year. About 50% of the approximately $1.2 trillion set aside for discretionary spending each year pays for most of the operations of government, including employee salaries and the maintenance of federal buildings. It also covers science and technology spending, foreign affairs initiatives, education spending, federally provided transportation costs, and many of the redistributive benefits most people in the United States have come to take for granted. The other half of discretionary spending, and the second largest component of the total budget, is devoted to the military. Only Social Security is larger. Defense spending is used to maintain the U.S. military presence at home and abroad, procure and develop new weapons, and cover the cost of any wars or other military engagements in which the United States is currently engaged. In theory, the amount of revenue raised by the national government should be equal to these expenses. But with the exception of a brief period from 1998 to 2000, that has not been the case. The economic recovery from the 2007 to 2009 recession and budget control efforts implemented in the early 2010s managed to cut the annual deficit by more than half by 2015. The annual deficit is the amount by which expenditures are greater than revenues. However, the amount of money the U.S. government needed to borrow to pay its bills in 2016 was still in excess of $400 billion. This was in addition to the country's almost $19 trillion of total debt, the amount of money the government owes its creditors, at the end of 2015, according to the Department of Treasury. The total debt as of March 2021 is $22 trillion. Balancing the budget has been a major goal of both the Republican and Democratic parties for the past several decades, although the parties tend to disagree on the best way to accomplish the task. One frequently offered solution, particularly among supply-side advocates, is to simply cut spending. This has proven to be much easier said than done. If Congress were to try to balance the budget only through discretionary spending, it would need to cut about 1/3 of spending on programs like defense, higher education, agriculture, police enforcement, transportation, and general government operations. Given the number and popularity of many of these programs, it is difficult to imagine this would be possible. To use spending cuts alone as a way to control the deficit, Congress will almost certainly be required to cut or control the costs of mandatory spending programs like Social Security and Medicare, a radically unpopular step. Tax policy. The other option available for balancing the budget is to increase revenue. all governments must raise revenue in order to operate. The most common way is by applying some sort of tax on residents or on their behaviors in exchange for the benefits the government provides. As necessary as taxes are, however, they are not without potential downfalls. First, the more money the government collects to cover its costs, the less residents are left with to spend and invest. Second, attempts to raise revenues through taxation may alter the behavior of residents in ways that are counterproductive to the state and the broader economy. Excessively taxing necessary and desirable behaviors, like consumption with a sales tax or investment with a capital gains tax, will discourage citizens from engaging in them, potentially slowing economic growth. The goal of tax policy, then, is to determine the most effective way of meeting the nation's revenue obligations without harming other public policy goals. As you would expect, Keynesians and supply-siders disagree about which forms of tax policy are best. Keynesians, with their concern about whether consumers can really stimulate demand, prefer progressive taxes systems that increase the effective tax rate as the taxpayer's income increases. This policy leaves those most likely to spend their money with more money to spend. For example, in 2015, U.S. taxpayers who were married and filing jointly paid a 10% tax rate on the first $18,450 of income, but 15% on the next $56,450. Some income is excluded. The rate continued to rise to up to 39.6% on any taxable income over $464,850. Following the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, these tax brackets were shifted. While the lowest bracket remained at a rate of 10%, the highest tax rate was reduced from 39.6% to 37%. These brackets are somewhat distorted by the range of tax credits, deductions, and incentives the government offers. But the net effect is that the top income earners pay a greater portion of the overall income tax burden than do those at the lowest tax brackets. According to the Pew Research Center, based on tax returns in 2014, 2.7% of filers made more than $250,000. Those 2.7% of filers paid 52% of the income tax paid. Supply-siders, on the other hand, prefer regressive tax systems, which lower the overall rate as individuals make more money. This does not automatically mean the wealthy will pay less than the poor, simply that the percentage of their income they pay in taxes will be lower. Consider, for example, the use of excise taxes on specific goods or services as a source of revenue. Sometimes called sin taxes because they tend to be applied to goods like alcohol, tobacco, and gasoline, excise taxes have a regressive quality, since the amount of the good purchased by the consumer, and thus the tax paid, does not increase at the same rate as income. A person who makes $250,000 per year is likely to purchase more gasoline than a person who makes $50,000 per year. But the higher earner is not likely to purchase 5 times more gasoline, which means the proportion of income paid out in gasoline taxes is less than the proportion for a lower earning individual. Another example of a regressive tax paid by most U.S. workers is the payroll tax that funds Social Security. While workers contribute 7.65% of their income to pay for Social Security, and their employers pay a matching amount, in 2015, the payroll tax was applied to only the first $118,500 of income. Individuals who earned more than that, or who made money from other sources like investments, saw their overall tax rate fall as their income increased. In 2020, the United States raised about $3.4 trillion in revenue. Income taxes, $1.6 trillion. Payroll taxes on Social Security and Medicare, $1.3 trillion. And excise taxes, $87 billion, make up three of the largest sources of revenue for the federal government. When combined with corporate income taxes, $212 billion, these four tax streams make up about 95% of total government revenue. The balance of revenue is split nearly evenly between revenues from the Federal Reserve and a mix of revenues from import tariffs, estate and gift taxes, and various fees or fines paid to the government. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed in December 2017 by the Republican-controlled Congress and significantly reduced the income tax rate paid by corporations, has led to a widening budget deficit. November 2018 featured the largest single-month deficit in the history of the country, with $411 billion in spending and only $206 billion in receipts. And the annual budget shortfall is approaching $1 trillion. The Federal Reserve Board and interest rates. Financial panics arise when too many people, worried about the solvency of their investments, try to withdraw their money at the same time. Such panics plagued U.S. banks until 1913, when Congress enacted the Federal Reserve Act. The act established the Federal Reserve System, also known as the Fed, as the central bank of the United States. The Fed's three original goals to promote were maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. All of these goals bring stability. The Fed's role is now broader and includes influencing monetary policy, the means by which the nation controls the size and growth of the money supply, supervising and regulating banks, and providing them with financial services like loans. The Federal Reserve System is overseen by a board of governors known as the Federal Reserve Board. The President of the United States appoints the 7 governors, each of whom serves a 14-year terms. The terms are staggered. A chair and vice chair lead the board for terms of 4 years each. The most important work of the board is participating in the Federal Open Market Committee to set monetary policy, like interest rate levels and macroeconomic policy. The board also oversees a network of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, each of which serves as a banker's bank for the country's financial institutions.
Insider perspective. The role of the Federal Reserve Chair. If you have read or watched the news for the past several years, perhaps you have heard the names Janet Yellen, Ben Bernanke, or Alan Greenspan. Bernanke, Greenspan, and Yellen are all recent past chairs of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Jerome Powell is the current chair. The role of the Fed chair is one of the most important in the country. By raising or lowering banks' interest rates, the chair has the ability to reduce inflation or stimulate growth. The Fed's dual mandate is to keep inflation low, under 2%, and unemployment low, below 5%. But efforts to meet these goals can often lead to contradictory monetary policies. The Fed, and by extension its chair, have a tremendous responsibility. Many of the economic events of the past 5 decades, both good and bad, are the results of Fed policies. In the 1970s, double-digit inflation brought the economy almost to a halt, but when Paul Volcker became chair in 1979, he raised interest rates and jump-started the economy. After the stock market crash of 1987, then-Chair Alan Greenspan declared, "The Federal Reserve, consistent with its responsibilities as the nation's central bank, affirmed today its readiness to support the economic and financial system." His lowering of interest rates led to an unprecedented decade of economic growth through the 1990s. In the 2000s, consistently low interest rates and readily available credit contributed to the subprime mortgage boom and subsequent bust, which led to a global economic recession beginning in 2008. Should the important tasks of the Fed continue to be pursued by unelected appointees, like those profiled in this box, or should elected leaders be given the job? Why?
This has been American Government, 3rd edition, an OpenStax textbook. All OpenStax textbooks are covered under a Creative Commons license and are completely free. For more details, visit openstax.org.
The music is Take Me Higher by Jazzar, which is also covered under Creative Commons license. His website is betterwithmusic.com.
We want to give special thanks to CC ECHO, the California Consortium for Equitable Change in Hispanic-Serving Institutions, Open Educational Resources, for providing the funding for this project. You can learn more about CC ECHO by visiting hancockcollege.edu/ccECHO.
If you would like to contact us, please email audiobook@fastmail.com. Thank you for listening and for sharing this recording with a colleague or friend.